For our purposes today, I have divided this talk into three parts. O come, Emmanuel, in the lenses of church history. O come, Emmanuel, in the lenses of biblical history. And O come, Emmanuel, in the lenses of our future that we have as God's people. So let's look at how this hymn was shaped in church history. Next to being good theologians and knowing how to use a Bible, I would commend you to be good historians. The quickest way you can be is by grabbing a hymnal and using it every day. And so we come now to this wonderful hymn, O come, Emmanuel. Originally it had 7 stanzas. I'm going to be using the original 7 stanzas to frame the sermon when we get to the biblical record. We only have 5 because the 7 original stanzas have been condensed to 5 stanzas and they've been flipped around. We're going to sing at the end of this talk 4 of those 5 stanzas of O come, Emmanuel. Now, to give you a little bit of a history lesson, those of you that attend my class, this is going to be old hat. The first 3 centuries of the church was known as the age of martyrdom. More Christians were killed in the first 3 centuries for their faith than perhaps at any other time except for the 20th and 21st century. More Christians in the last 120 years have been persecuted perhaps than any other time in the history of the church. But the first 3 centuries, the state was killing Christians, and Christians, in order to meet, had to meet in caves, in catacombs, in houses. But an emperor came to the throne in the early 4th century by the name of Constantine that changed all that. And Constantine was the first Roman emperor to officially recognize Christianity as a legitimate religion. And this changed because overnight, Christians went from people that were persecuted and had to hide to now not persecuted and actually protected by Constantine, who considered himself a Christian. Now they went public. And for the first time in the 4th century, things like church buildings were built in public squares that had a cross on them. And people began to jam into Christian buildings on Sunday, and worshiping as a Christian was now popular. The Christian coffers of treasury began to grow, and the church was at its wealthiest. And so they could train pastors. They could start schools for pastors. They could support missionaries. They could support poor and charitable organizations in a way that they never could to the degree after Constantine. But after several centuries, what happened is the church became opulent. It became very prosperous, and it lost this sense of being against the world. And so there were Christians within the church that broke away from the church due to this opulence. And they were known as the Desert Fathers, or asceticism. St. Anthony, for example, was perhaps the most famous desert father. They literally went into the desert and lived off the land because they believed that a Christian should deny themselves, should not be a part of the world, and the church was becoming like the world and making money and building these fancy buildings and this sort of thing. But there was another movement that didn't go that far, that said, well, if you remove yourself completely, Jesus, we don't think, taught that. We go back into the world, and they became known as the Monastic Order. If you grew up Catholic, you probably had to read the Benedictine Book of Order, which is really marvelous when it comes to administration. And these monks set up monasteries, and they said, we are to deny ourselves, so we will not take a wife. We will not participate in certain pleasures to deny ourselves like Jesus said, but we won't remove ourselves completely from the world. So for example, during this time, the monastic order tended gardens, and they used their food to feed the poor in their communities. They wrote hymns, and the profits that they would make from their hymns, they would give to the poor. So they were very much a part of the community. Well, in the 7th century, these group of monks wrote a 7-stanza hymn that they chanted once a year. The 7 stanzas were for each day of the week leading up to the final week before Christmas. And that chant was O come, Emmanuel, written by a group of monks. You didn't know how Catholic you were when you sang the hymn. And so these monks chanted 7 stanzas, and perhaps the closest thing that's glorious is, if you're a Mannheim Steamroller fan, Chip Davis in his second album, if you're really big into it, you do it by colors, right? It's the Blue Album, rewrote. He went to a monastery in Europe, and he did the lead-in to O come, Emmanuel, listening to a monastic order chant it. And that's pretty close to the original of the 17th century. So the week before Christmas, every stanza would be chanted, 1 stanza a day leading up to Christmas. And they wrote it based upon the antiphons of the Old Testament. Now, if you remember a couple of years ago, we preached the antiphons. The antiphons of the Old Testament are the O and the name of God that has messianic connection. So, O wisdom, O Emmanuel, O dayspring. And there's 7 of them in the Old Testament. And these monks took all 7 Old Testament scriptures, and every stanza of O come, Emmanuel begins with these antiphons. And so they would chant them. Now, we fast forward. Hold on, we're still in the church history component, giving you context here. If we fast forward to the 13th or 14th century, we're now in medieval times. If you know anything about history, you know they're known as the Dark Ages, right? It's a dark time for the church, but we should not shun the medieval times. There's great spirituality in medieval. And so the church rescued this chant, but they put music to it. So for the first time, O come, Emmanuel has music, and it's written deliberately to have a somber, introspective, almost a funeral oracle tone to it. So if you sing O come, Emmanuel, and you put it next to Joy to the World, completely different tunes, completely different feels. That's on purpose. So when they read the text and they talk about ransomed sinners and we're in the darkness, they wanted to get music to fit that. And so Led Zeppelin wasn't around. That would have been the best thing, but they weren't there. I mean, we are going to sing them in heaven probably. But anyway, O come, put to you. Now, if we fast forward to the 19th century, there's a guy somebody else. John Mason Neal, N-E-A. John Mason Neal in the 19th century was raised in an evangelical church. He was a prodigy. He went off to school and studied Greek and Latin and became a translator. Was paid Latin text. The more he studied Latin text, the more disenchanted he became with his evangelical roots. He looked at old church buildings and saw that they were dilapidated, in disrepair. He's like, this is the Lord's house, and no one cares the way they look. That got him into studying medieval history, and he then became studying to become an Anglican priest. So he left his evangelical roots, went into Anglicanism to become a priest, but got hit with an illness, and he had to leave London and go to North Africa, and he's there for 20 years in convalescence because he's got an illness. While he's sick, he thrusts himself both into writing, to research, and into social gospel issues. So he begins to make money on his hymns. And they're all initially hymn books to the disenfranchised. His first edition is Hymns to the Sick. His second is Hymns to the Elderly. His third is Hymns to Widows. His fourth is Hymns to Children. So you get the sense of what he's at. He uses that money and he funds the first Christian nursing school in North Africa. And during those 20 years, he finds an old Latin text from the 13th century called O Come, Emmanuel. And it's John Mason Neal, a evangelical turned Anglican, that translates it into English. And as soon as he does, everyone starts singing it, and we've sung it ever since in English. That's the history lesson. You may not go to heaven over that, but it gives you some context. Now let me say before I leave the benefits of why we do something like that. Now let me preface what I'm about to say, because I know it's easy to get misunderstood here, and I want no misunderstanding. I am all for modern hymn writing, modern sing. I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? I mean, Isaac Watts had to start writing modern hymns. But one of my problems, if all a church gets is new music, say, written in the last year, is it's never had time to be vetted by the church. Just because you hear it on K-Love doesn't mean the church ought to be singing it. And the reason for that is it may not be theologically tested. It may be. I love the Gettys, by the way. But it may not be. But a hymn that has been around for 1,300 years has been vetted. A hymn that your grandparents sang and your grandparents' grandparents sang. And it's still around, and your kids are going to sing it probably. This is where church history is safe, because it lets us know when we sing this in a few moments, we don't just stand at 8130 Lackman Count. We stand on the shoulders of thousands of saints who have sung this hymn through the generations, and it's still going strong. And there's a reason for it. There is a reason. So, that's the history lesson. Now let's look at the text in biblical understanding. This is where we'll have to get our Bibles out and run from the Old Testament to the New Testament, because all 7 stanzas are framed around the Bible. They're very much like Handel's Messiah that would come later, who literally takes texts of Scripture and quilts them together to form this hymn. Almost, not quite, but almost every line is taken from a phrase from either Old or New Testament. And I'm going to be highlighting the 7 original and in their order, because there's a reason they're in the order they're in originally. So first, we come to O Sapaceion, that is O Wisdom. I'm giving you Latin there. And you all just sang Latin, so we're all in a Latin group, right? O Wisdom, let me quote the line in the original. O come, O wisdom from on high, who orders all things mightily. To us the path of knowledge show, and teach us in its ways to go. The authors set in motion what the Scriptures teach, that God alone in his great wisdom created the universe. That this universe did not emerge out of chaos, but out of a God that had a plan and order for things. And that's how the line starts. And this great wisdom, this all-wise God, had a plan not only in creation, but in redemption. So in the coming of his Son, who became a man to die for sinners, so that those sinners and men and women could now get to God, was not half shot, shooting from the hip. It was an accidental. It came from the planning of an all-wise God. So, for example, if you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we have a good description of this mission of Jesus and good food for fodder for this season of Advent in our lives. Here in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, beginning in, we'll just chapter 1, verse 18, the preaching of the cross is to them that is perishing foolishness. So those that are unbelievers look at the whole economy of the cross and see nothing but stupidity. But to us which are saved, Paul will say here and say later, it is the power and wisdom of God. And he unpacks this wisdom the rest of the chapter. For Paul, when we look at the cross, when we look at the coming of Jesus to his death, to bring sinners to redemption, we see not a reckless God. We see a God who is all-wise. And this is why Paul can later say in Timothy, when he sings his own hymn, now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God. So brothers and sisters, as you celebrate Christmas this week, and your Advent, and you're getting ready for Christmas, think of your God being all-wise. And if he has wisely held the universe in the palm of his hand, he certainly knows your life. And he certainly has ordered it and planned it. And so we join with old Christians and say, "O come thou wisdom from on high." The second stanza deals with the Adonai of God, the Lord. O come, great Lord of might, who to your tribes on Sinai's height in ancient times did give the law in cloud and majesty and awe. The second stanza of the original piece of O Come, now progresses from God as the creator of all things to the Lord that is the lawgiver to his people, who covenants with his people and says in Exodus chapter 9, where, by the way, this stanza comes from, Exodus 19, where before God issues the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, he identifies himself to his people in Exodus 19, that I am the Lord of all, and now I'm giving you this law so that you know what it means to enter a covenant with me. You know what I expect from you to identify you as my people. And only those who are completely righteous are those who fulfill the law. But then we have a problem, don't we? You and I do not fulfill the law of its demands. And so the hymn then has a messianic in that second stanza. Look to, if you turn to Matthew chapter 5. There, in Matthew 5, you'll recall, Jesus, the greatest preacher who ever lived, is about ready to preach the greatest sermon ever preached. It would take you about 15 minutes to read it. From Matthew 5 to the end of Matthew 7, it's known as the Sermon on the Mount. You'll remember, for the most part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is unpacking the law, the 10 Commandments. But he's applying it to the human heart. And he's talking about what real righteousness looks like. That you and I have a heart problem. But at the beginning of this talk, he talks about himself in chapter 5, verse 17, when he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. I have come not to abolish it, but to fulfill it." Jesus is saying the law gets its fulfillment in me. So it's not about you trying to do a bunch of things, jumping through loops, checking marks to see that you've measured up. It's about you believing in me as the great law keeper. And in coming to me, you now are completely righteous. This is exactly what Jesus is saying, and what the hymn writer in stanza 2 is pointing toward when they call Jesus, O great Lord of might. Third stanza, O rod of Jesse, or it can be translated, O come, O branch of Jesse's stem, unto your own and rescue them. From depths of hell your people save, and give them victory o'er the grave. This is taken directly from Isaiah chapter 11 that deals with the genealogy of the Messiah, the house of David, that began with a stump, literally is the picture in Isaiah. This old stump, out in a field that seems to us to be worthless and a waste. What good does a stump do except wreck my lawnmower when I roll over it? A stump is there, it's dead, get rid of it. But that represents the house of Jesse, who was of no particular value himself. He was not, after all, a son of a king. And yet, the text says that a little shoot will come out from that dead stump, a little branch, and it will develop into a tree. If you're really into Advent and you've ever heard of the Jesse tree, and you've done your kids, we did this for years, you understand the connections. And in Isaiah 11, we have this tree, this messianic tree, that God promises that the Messiah will come from this stump of Jesse. If we fast forward back to the New Testament, you're in the New Testament, turn back with me to Romans chapter 15. There, Paul takes the words of Isaiah and applies them directly to Jesus Christ. There, as he ends this great book in Romans chapter 15, beginning in verse 12. Paul says, Isaiah writes, "The root of Jesse will come," or the stump of Jesse. "Even he who arises to rule the Gentiles, in him will the Gentiles have hope." So he's now directly quoting Isaiah 11, which is the quotation of the third stanza originally of O Come, Emmanuel, of messianic. Well, who is this a fulfillment of? Paul writes earlier in verse 8 who exactly this is a fulfillment of when he says, "I tell you that Jesus Christ became a servant." And then he begins to tell you his credentials. If you're still in the dark of who this stump is, then we have to go no further than the words of Jesus himself in Revelation chapter 22, where he uses the messianic prophecy of Isaiah coming from Jesse's stump to apply to himself in the very last chapter of the book of the Bible, Revelation chapter 22, verse 16. "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright and morning star." The same word used by Isaiah. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the stump of Jesse, the root of Jesse, which is the catechism line of the third stanza of O Come, Emmanuel. The fourth original line is the key of David. O come, O key of David. Come and open wide our heavenly home. Make safe for us the heavenly road and bar the way to death's abode. Now, I won't take the time here. If you remember a few months ago when we were studying the book of Revelation, the key of David shows up in Isaiah 11. It's a story in the court of King Hezekiah, and he has a chief of staff. The chief of staff is the one who had the privilege to hold the key of David. The key of David in ancient Israel is different than our keys. Our keys, we have a lot of them, and they're small, right? So I can fit them in my pocket. The key of David, according to Isaiah 11, is so large that one guy had to carry it on his shoulders. And we make duplicates for our keys. A lot of times I'll say that. How many keys did I give to these people? The key of David, only one person held it, and that was the emissary of the king. And as such, it was his responsibility of who got access to the king. He could shut the door, he could open it. That's the whole issue of Isaiah 11. If you remember in the churches of Revelation, well, since you're in Revelation, you can turn back there to Revelation chapter 3. And Jesus says he is the fulfillment of that prediction of the key of David in Revelation chapter 3, writing to the church at Philadelphia. Do you remember? The words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one will open. Jesus is saying, because I have the key of David, I have the power to get you access to the presence of God or to shut you out. And so in the fourth stanza of O Come, Emmanuel, we are praising God that Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah 11, and that in Jesus and only in Jesus do you and I have access to the presence of God at any moment. The fifth stanza is O Orientus, or Orients, again Latin. It's often not translated O come, O Orient, or East. Some texts you do. You can actually find this in some Methodist hymnals. But it's often translated day spring or bright and morning star. O come, O bright and morning star, and bring us comfort from afar. Dispel the shadows of the night and turn our darkness into light. This is a direct quote from Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, where Israel was in the dark ages, and they were pining and praying that the Messiah would come, and with the Messiah give them light. And you'll recall that there's a time, an interim between testaments, 400 years between the Old and New Testament, where not one prophet spoke. Can you imagine that? 400 years of a country's history and not one preacher that ever said, "Thus saith the Lord." 400 years, and the prophets were like, the Jedis at the end of episode 3. They got convalescence elsewhere and got out of the galaxy. And so here, before that happens, Israel is pining that you would bring a light in the darkness. And in Luke chapter 1, Jesus says he is that day spring. If you turn to Luke, and this wonderful passage where it's really Mary's, the angel comes and tells Mary why she should remain and how blessed she is to bear this child. And in Luke chapter 1, verses 78 and 79, Zechariah makes this prophecy and uses Scripture and says, to give knowledge of salvation to his people. This is what the coming Messiah will do in the forgiveness of their sins because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise will visit us from on high and will give light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Have you ever wondered that this time of the year is called the season of lights? I mean, this is the darkest time of our life, right? I mean, the sun goes down it seems like at 4:08, At 4:45 the other night, I go outside, the sun is going down. I'm getting depressed. And so it's the longest amount of darkness we have, and yet we shine more light during this season, right? You've got candles at your house. You got Christmas lights up, probably on outside your house. Every room is lit up. And that's the symbolism behind this point, that Jesus comes in a dark world. No prophecy. Israel has rebelled against its God. They're their last hope. And just as they are, comes the light of all the nations in Jesus to give great hope. And this Jesus, by the way, still shines light. And you and I live in a dark place. You don't need to be told that. You don't come here to get more depressed. But we're living in some dark, dark days. And this message is still true. The only hope is Jesus, the light of the world. The sixth stanza of 7 is now, O Rex, O come, O King of nations, bind in one the hearts of all mankind. Bid all our sad divisions cease, and be yourself our King of peace. This is often in the English text translated desire of nations, which is taken from Haggai chapter 2, verse 7, the passage we looked at last week. And here it is applied to Jesus, of course, who will come as a peace that will gather the nations and in division. And you think, well, Jesus actually creates some, but not in this messianic sense. Notice, if you will, the fulfillment of this that Jesus brings up in Matthew chapter 8, There, in Matthew chapter 8, he goes and he's asked to heal a centurion's servant, Gentile. And Jesus is getting ready to go, and the centurion says, you don't even have to go to my house because I know that's ceremonial unclean because I'm a Gentile. All you have to do is say the word. You don't have to see, you don't have to lay hands, you don't have to do a chant, a dance. All you have to do is say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus, and it's not by accident he said this in Matthew's gospel, Jesus, quite provocative, wanting to pick a fight, says, never in all Israel have I seen such faith. I mean, that's a gut punch, right? This is a Gentile he's saying this to. In all Israel, that would be like saying, we've never seen such patriotism in this country than by the Shiite Muslim who lives down the street. I mean, it's just crazy. And Jesus says that to this Gentile. And when he says it, he begins to unfold the curtain of the Messianic age in glory about peace and ending division. When he says, beginning in verse 10, I tell you, many will come from the east, this is verse 11, many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Now we know he's addressing this Gentiles, all nations, because the very next line is, while many of the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into outer darkness. That's Jews. People who think they're getting there because of their Jewishness won't be there. But I'm telling you that there's a day coming when those who believe in me will recline at the table. Together will have fellowship with Abraham, with all of these saints. This then is the fulfillment of this Lord of all nations, bid our sad division cease and be to us the King of peace. And the last stanza that was deliberately written as the last stanza, but it's our first one, the one that we're most familiar with. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears. Probably not going to be a top 40 hit. You know, it's a song that talks about sadness and mourning. And the mourning here is because Israel is in captivity and needs to be ransomed. And the only hope for that mourning to stop is when the Son of God appears. And of course, we probably know this comes from Isaiah 7:14, where a virgin will conceive and give forth to a child, and you will call his name Emmanuel. And this, of course, is then taken into Matthew chapter 1, where Joseph, interestingly, is consulted 3 times in Matthew's story. 3 different times an angel comes to Joseph, every single time about the safety of the child. And in this first one, he comes to Joseph and says that, verse 23, this is to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. This is Jesus. The only deity in the world, by the way, who is said to be with us. Every other deity that everybody else except Christians are worshiping today has a deity that's above them. Detached, remote, indifferent, and only shows up to beat them when they do bad things. But Jesus is God with us. With us. So, what are the lessons before we close of this great hymn? One, I'll leave you with one for sake of time, is that God's word can be trusted. Every stanza of the original of O Come, is based upon Scripture that has been fulfilled in Jesus. So, beloved, when you as a family go into your houses and you do your cooking or you're on your schedules, as crazy it is, to consider that the message of Advent in Jesus, there's a lot of messages there. One is, God always keeps His word. And the Bible then is safe that can be trusted. Everything predicted about Jesus has been fulfilled. But finally, this hymn has future, right? If you read the words of the hymn writer, it's still this, "O come, O come." Writers that have experienced the first advent, like we have, but are now looking to the second. That this same Jesus who was all wise, who came from Jesse's tree, who is the only access to God, who now has all the law fulfilled in him, who is now with us, is a God that we long to be with and long to return. And that hymn then, when we sing it, is not only a praise song for what God has done, but it's a prayer that he come and be with us and we be where he is at. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, the only hope is Jesus Christ, who came in the flesh, died a sinner's death, and rose from the dead to give you life. And it's only Jesus that can do it. And he promises to do it.